कि हमारा मदरसा अल-कुबा उसका कोई और मकसद नहीं है। मैं सिर्फ ये चाहता हूँ कि अहले सुन्नत के कुछ अफराद नौजवान तैयार हो जाएं, हमें बच्चे दें और मौलवी लें।
Welcome back to another one of our weekly videos of the Al-Tahawiyya. Alhamdulillah, we're making our way through the work on this creed of the Ahlul Sunnah wal Jama'ah. And in the last lesson, we started talking about the concept of Allah Ta'ala's will and Allah Ta'ala's pleasure. And we touched on some of the issues to do with that in the last lesson. So before we move on to the next part of the text, what we'll do is we'll speak about the idea in a little bit more detail, and then inshallah the next few points will make a little bit more sense, will be a bit easier to digest. So we spoke of the idea that everything comes from Allah Ta'ala. All things are by the will of Allah. Whether that's good acts or whether that's evil acts. Allah Ta'ala is the creator of all actions. We do not affirm as the Ahlul Sunnah that we are creators of our own actions. We don't create our actions. Rather, what happens is when we make by our free will a choice to do a particular action, then Allah Ta'ala wills for that action to come into existence, and then we acquire the action. In Arabic, we call this qasab. Qasab. Qaf, Sin, Ba. Qasab. So we are muqtasib, we are qasib, we are the ones who acquire the actions. You can only acquire something which already exists. If something doesn't already exist, can you acquire it? You can't, can you? It's not possible to gain something that's not existing. So the fact that we are those that acquire our actions, we gain our action, we do qasab of our action, this affirms as well that our action already exists. How does it exist already? Because the existence of our actions is dependent upon the will of Allah, the irada of Allah, the qudra of Allah. So we don't create our own actions. Our actions are a result of these things, and we just acquire that which already exists. The fact that it happens in a split second, that's not a problem. So for example, like just as an example, I make the intention that I want to pick up this glass and I pick it up. Even though in a split second I picked it up and I put it back down, the reality remains that the only way I was able to pick that glass up and the only way I was able to put it back down was because Allah willed for it to happen. That ability was created, and then I acquired that ability to do the action. I did that action of my own free will, and that's why I will be held to account for it. And that action of picking up and putting down the glass, it's not a rewardable action, it's not a punishable action, so there's no accountability for it in terms of reward or punishment. But if that was an action which was rewardable, then Allah Ta'ala would reward me for it. Why? Because I chose to do that action. And likewise, if it was an evil action, if it was an action that wasn't good, then again Allah Ta'ala would hold me to account, I would be punished for it. But that doesn't remove the fact that Allah was the one who created the ability and created the action that I then acquired, good or evil. Which, as I say again, affirms the position of the Ahlul Sunnah that we are the creators of our, we are not the creators of our own actions. Allah is the creator of all things, good and evil. Out of adab and out of respect and out of manners and decorum in the presence of Allah, we don't openly say that Allah creates evil. But when we're studying it as a matter of Aqidah and a matter of creed, then we don't affirm that Allah Ta'ala didn't create evil, Allah Ta'ala didn't create these things. Then that comes back to a question which was asked last week, and we'll sort of use that as a foundation to move on then in the text. The question that was asked, if you recall last week, was that evil, why does Allah Ta'ala create it then? If Allah Ta'ala doesn't want it, like it's not desired by Allah that we do evil deeds, and why is He creating it? So the answer to that was, as I mentioned last lesson, was that one thing is the irada of Allah, which we've already been looking at, and the mashi'a of Allah. Irada and mashi'a broadly are synonymous, meaning that they both are the same thing broadly. The irada of Allah and the mashia of Allah. This has to be with everything, good or evil. However, the pleasure of Allah, this is a different concept, the pleasure of Allah. In Arabic, when we talk about the pleasure of Allah, we talk about the rida of Allah. Yeah, the pleasure of Allah, Allah being pleased with an action. Now let's ask ourselves, for example, just for example, picking up this glass. For example, if we imagine that picking up this glass was an evil action, would we affirm that Allah's irada existed there? When I picked up the glass, was Allah's irada there? Yes. Why? Because if it wasn't, could that picking up of the glass have happened? No. Allah's irada had to be there even though it was an evil action. For example, even though it was an evil action. But was Allah's pleasure there? Is Allah pleased by me doing that evil action? No. Same situation, but let's change it. Imagine picking up this glass was an act of reward. Imagine picking up this glass was a rewardable action. So now I pick up the glass, same question. Was Allah's irada there? Yes, no?
Yes.
Yes. Why? Because Allah's irada has to be with before everything. Something can only come into existence if Allah's irada is there, Allah's will. Irada means will. Allah's will had to be there. So that clearly was there. But because it's now a rewardable action that we're talking about, is Allah's pleasure there as well?
Yes.
That's the difference. Allah is the creator of all actions, but when it comes to the good actions, the pleasurable, the rewardable actions, the irada and the qudra are there along with the rida of Allah, the pleasure of Allah. And when it comes to those actions which are not pleasing to Allah, then His irada and His qudra are there. Why? Because that's what's needed for something to come into existence. But His rida will not be there, His pleasure will not be there. So hopefully that clarifies. Just before you move on, if you just put your legs so that people that are coming, maybe just push the benches a little bit forward, just a bit. And it makes a bit more space for the people that are coming. So now that we have that in our minds, let's just step back a little bit to the previous discussion that we were having. So Imam Al-Tahawi rahimahullah ta'ala, those of you that are following the book, I'm looking at page 40 at the bottom. Page 40 at the bottom. So Imam Al-Tahawi rahimahullah ta'ala, what does he say? He says, وَأَمَرَهُمْ بِطَاعَتِهِ وَنَهَاهُمْ عَنْ مَعْصِيَتِهِ وَكُلُّ شَيْءٍ يَجْرِي بِقُدْرَتِهِ وَمَشِيئَتِهِ. So he says that Allah Ta'ala, He commanded them, He ordered them to His obedience. What does Allah desire of us? What does Allah want of us? Obedience. Allah wants us to be obedient. Ta'ah. Somebody could say, if that's what Allah wants, then why are there disobedient people in the world? Because remember, when we talk about Allah's will and what He wants of us, He doesn't force that upon us. Because if He forced it upon us and we had no free will, then accountability is no longer an issue. You can't be held accountable if you don't have free will. Allah made it clear to us through the messengers, through the revelation, through all of these divine inspirations that come to all the Anbiya and the Prophets, that this is what I want. This is what you're supposed to be doing. Aqimus salah, atuz zakah, do hajj, do this, don't do evil, don't do this. This is what I want you to do, this is what I don't want you to do. Now what are you going to do? This is the test of your free will. What do you choose to do? Amarahum bi ta'ati. He commanded obedience and He prohibited from disobedience. And then He left us with our free will to make choices in the dunya. And those choices are the ones upon which we're then held to account, and that's the basis upon which reward and punishment is given in the akhirah. That's why Allah Ta'ala is just. He doesn't go against His justice now, because as I said last lesson, imagine Allah forced something upon us, good or evil, you're neither entitled to reward nor deserving of punishment, because you had no choice. Everything was forced upon you. We don't affirm anything being forced. As the Ahlul Sunnah, we affirm that there is free will. Free will exists. وَكُلُّ شَيْءٍ يَجْرِي بِقُدْرَتِهِ وَمَشِيئَتِهِ. And He says that everything, so here the emphasis being on everything. Previously He talked about ta'ah and ma'asiyah, obedience and disobedience. That was by His command and by His prohibitions. But regardless, whether it's the ta'ah, the obedience, or whether it's the ma'asiyah, the disobedience, everything is dependent in coming about upon the qudra of Allah, the power of Allah, wa mashi'atihi, and upon His willing it. If Allah's qudra and His mashi'ah don't relate to something, that thing will never come into existence. وَمَشِيئَتُهُ تَنْفُذُ. He just sort of emphasizes the point. He says that his mashi'ah, his will be executed. His will happen. It's never going to be the case. Now this is an important point from an Aqidah perspective. Why? His will always occur. It will never be the case that Allah wills for something and then it doesn't happen. Why is that important? Because when you say that Allah willed something and then it didn't happen, then that's affirming inability for Allah. That's affirming ajz for Allah. You say that Allah is ajiz, Allah is incapable of doing something. Any minute that you affirm incapability, that being cannot be God. Anytime you affirm incapability, it's not able to do that, then that is not God. This is important because that's our conceptualization of God. All of the objections to do with the ability of God and the limitations of God and all of that, they fall away from the Muslim. Why? Because as a Muslim, our concept of God doesn't involve anything, meaning making Allah Ta'ala unable, making him ajiz. Remember right at the beginning we talked about the text, La yu'jizuhu shay, or however it was worded, that nothing can incapacitate Allah. Allah is qadir over all things, as we talked about in the previous discussions, that relates to the possibilities. When we talk about those things which Allah doesn't do, that's in relation to the impossibilities. The qudra of Allah never relates to the impossibilities. That's not ajz. That's just the manifestation never occurring of these impossible things because the qudra never happens. Qudra doesn't relate to those things. It's a bit of a technical point, but it's an important point, that we never ever affirm inability for Allah. We never affirm inability for Allah because that's the sign of, that's a weakness, that's the sign of neediness, that's the sign of creation, not the sign of God. لا مشيئة للعباد إلا ما شاء لهم فما شاء لهم كان وما لم يشاء لم يكن. He says, Imam Al-Tahawi, he says, لا مشيئة للعباد. There's no will for the people. Now this at first glance, when you first look at it, that might go against everything we've said about free will. We've been saying so far, time and time again, that we have free will. And it's that free will upon which we're judged, it's that free will upon which we're rewarded and punished. So why is Imam Al-Tahawi here saying La mashi'ata lil ibad? And why is he saying that the people, the bondsmen, don't have any will? What he's relating this to is the will of Allah. What he's affirming is that Allah's will is what is like Allah's will is what gives effect to things, not our will. I could will for this glass to start levitating. I can will it for the rest of my life. It's never going to happen based on my will. But the moment Allah wills it to happen, it will happen. So my mashi'ah, my willing things, doesn't make anything happen. When I will to pick up this glass, look, I've picked it up. Was I able to pick it up because I willed it? No, it was picked up because Allah willed it and I acquired that. So la mashi'ata lil ibad, our willing of things, that doesn't have effect. Yeah? Please, as I say this pretty much every lesson, don't wait till the end to ask questions on these types of questions. If there's anything that you get confused on as we're going along, because they are a little bit tricky concepts, some of them, please just stick your hand up and ask. It's better that you ask immediately so that the issue is rectified, rather than forget the question and then understand it in a confused way. So he says La mashi'ata lil ibad in that meaning, not in the meaning that we don't have free will. Of course we have free will, and I think I've labeled the point a lot, but I'll say it one more time. If you don't have free will, you don't have accountability, because then it's unjust for you to be punished, and it's unfair and undeserving for you to be rewarded. Whatever Allah Ta'ala wills happens, and whatever He doesn't will doesn't happen. Everything is dependent upon the mashi'ah of Allah Ta'ala. Then he says, لا راد لقضائه ولا معقب لحكمه. He says there's none that can repel the decree of Allah. There's none that can repel and send away the decree of Allah. لا راد لقضائه. What does this allude to? It alludes to the idea that the qada, destiny, based on how we understood it in the previous lessons, destiny will manifest, destiny will occur. How does that mean? It means that, remember, when we talk about the qada of Allah, what are we talking about? We're talking about Allah's infinite knowledge of exactly what would happen. Nothing can come to change the knowledge of Allah. Why not? What's the issue with change? Allah Ta'ala bless those brothers that are making the short videos. There was an answer to this question in one of those short videos. What's the problem with change? Yes.
There has to be a beginning and an end.
And?
So Allah doesn't have a beginning, neither does He have an end.
Why not?
Because He's wajib al-wujud.
Okay.
So
You're not wrong. It's just, what does that mean?
He existed.
So why can He not have a beginning and an end? You're right. Anyone? Why can Allah Ta'ala, or you, why can Allah Ta'ala not have a beginning or an end? That's creation. How is that creation? He did. But how is beginning and end of creation? You're not wrong. Yeah, okay, so we came into being, Allah Ta'ala was always there. Again, that's right, it's not wrong. Any other takers? Yeah, that's not wrong. As I said, he's right. Laysa kamithlihi shay, but why not?
So from beginning to the end, there has to be change.
True, there has to be change. And
Beginning and end is a creation because that as us we creations we experience it and Allah does not experience anything as we creations experience because He's nothing like His creation.
good, good, that's true as well. But doesn't answer the question. Very good though, it's a very detailed answer.
Change indicates deficiency.
How so?
Something that wasn't there previously.
Yeah, true, that's all true. And then the limits point? I'll answer the question now. Beginning and an end? Yeah? It's limited. Yeah. So you're all right. Every single answer that all of you gave was right in dealing with the question. The reason why I wanted to do that exercise with all of you is this: look, this is exactly how you should be thinking as a Muslim. As a Muslim, you should never be shaken by the objections of an atheist. You should never be shaken by the confusion of the Western world. You should never be shaken by this, this modernity and all of that. Why? Muslims, we're not against modernity, we're not against, advancing in technology and things, but that should never shake your faith. If anything, it should strengthen your faith. In the past, people said, oh, how did the Prophet ﷺ travel from Makkah all the way to Aqsa in a short period of time? And then airplanes came along, right? So on and so forth. Advancements in technology and advancements, they shouldn't weaken your faith, they should strengthen your faith. And this is the thought process that you go through in addressing the issues. Like our God, as you all said, laysa kamithlihi shay, as you both said. You said no limits, you said no change, you said that we existed and then came into existence, you said Allah was always there. This is our God. Our God isn't the same as the Christian God. The one that manifested as a son and then as a spirit and then came into existence, that was crucified. That's not our God. You can't kill our God. Our God doesn't die. Our God is Mumit. He's the one who gives death. Life and death are dependent upon Him. None can give death to Allah. So that's not our conceptualization of God. And all of these other things that you said, so it's all perfectly right. So it's good to see that everyone's understanding. And what you find is that it all links together. Everything that every one of you just said was different but connected as well. And that's the nature of this study, that when you finish this, or when you get to some sort of, I suppose, like checkpoint, if you would, of the study of Aqidah, everything snaps into place. It all just makes sense. You have like a light bulb moment, you think, oh, that's what that meant. And we're literally at the verge of that. If you're not already there, we're literally on the verge of it. So inshallah, we pray for openings. But alhamdulillah, that's pleasing. Yeah.
I think we missed out a piece of text on the bottom of page 41.
We missed out a piece of text.
Yeah, the Arabic bit, right at the bottom.
Oh, we did. Okay, I'll come back to that in a minute. For bringing that to my attention. I'll come back to that. So let me finish this and I'll just jump back a little bit. La radda li qada'i. There's nothing which can repel His qada, His will, His decree. Wala mu'aqiba li hukmi. And there's none that can delay, ta'qib, to delay. There's none that can delay His judgment. Allah Ta'ala's judgments, why is that the case? Because think about it. Delaying of judgments is only going to occur when somebody has a greater authority than you. You want to do something and somebody of a greater authority says to you, no, you can't do that. So having a power over you, this is what delays judgments, this is what repels your decrees. If you are the supreme authority, then there's nothing that can repel you. Everything has to follow you, you have to follow nothing. Allah Ta'ala is like that, but not in the same way. But Allah Ta'ala is the absolute supreme authority, the sovereign authority. Nothing has any power over Allah. Allah has power over everything. Nothing can repel His qada. Nothing can postpone His decrees. Nothing can prevent Allah Ta'ala's will from manifesting and being applicable. These are the points which Imam Al-Tahawi is alluding to. I'll just come back a bit to that point that I missed on page 41. يهدي من يشاء ويعصم ويعافي فضله ويضل من يشاء ويخذل ويبتلي عدلا وكلهم يتقلبون في مشيئته بين فضله وعدله. Imam Al-Tahawi says that Allah Ta'ala guides whoever He wills, and Allah Ta'ala protects, and Allah Ta'ala gives afiyah. Afiyah is like this like protection and preservation and longevity. Allah Ta'ala gives all of that. How? Is it wajib upon Him to do that? Is it necessary for Allah to do what's good for us? No. Fadla. It's out of His mercy, it's out of His grace. This is an important point because what does it tackle? It tackles a point of a sect that was known as the Mu'tazila. The Mu'tazila. The Mu'tazila is one of the earliest sects of Islam. One of the earliest sects. And it takes its name from the founder and something that Sayyidina Hassan al-Basri said. Sayyidina Hassan al-Basri is one of the companions of Sayyidina Ali. So you can see how early it is. And the founder of the sect, Wali al-Jubai, he was sat in the presence of Sayyidina Hassan al-Basri and he disagreed with him on a point. And then instead of dealing with the issue with adab, with respect, with academia, he left the gathering of Sayyidina Hassan al-Basri and separated. And Sayyidina Hassan al-Basri said words which gave them that name. He said, "I'tazala anna." I'tazala anna. Yani he's left from us, he's moved away from us, he's separated from us. I'tazala anna, the words of the awliya are such that from that day him and his followers came to be known as the Mu'tazila, the ones who left. So the Mu'tazila, they have a lot of weird beliefs, and their beliefs are particularly related to aqaid. For example, one of the beliefs which they hold, which is problematic, is they believe in a state that exists between iman and kufr. So they believe that you can be in a state where you're not a Muslim but you're not a kafir either. They call it in Arabic manzil bayn al-manzilatin. We don't affirm that. You're either Muslim or you're not. Right? Kufr is the absence of iman. Iman is the absence of kufr. So you can't have a third state in the middle. That's what we affirm. Likewise, one of the things which they affirm, the Mu'tazila, is they affirm that it's wajib upon Allah to do what's good for a person. They affirm that it's wajib on Allah to do what's good for a person. And now and you may remember from the early introductory lessons we talked about this idea that there's two of the founding imams, or two of the leading imams I should say, of the Ahlus Sunnah creed. One of them was Imam Maturidi, who the majority of the Hanafis follow and we follow, and one of them is Imam Ash'ari. Imam Ash'ari. Imam Ash'ari was actually one of the leading imams of the Mu'tazila. Of his time, he was like the leading imam of the Mu'tazila. And one of the greatest Mu'tazila imams of his time. Until this point here. This point of it being wajib upon Allah to do what's good for a person. The conversation is lengthy and I can never remember it properly, but the gist of it was that he presents a question. He says that if there's somebody who gets to old age and dies and goes to hell, and he asks Allah Ta'ala, why did you let me get to old age? That it's not in His best interest to get there. Whereas, for example, if you have a child who dies as a baby, for example, and he says, how is that fair? His teacher answers and says something along the lines of, if that child grew up, then he would have fallen into sin and kufr, so it was better for that child to have left this world, so it was wajib on Allah to kill him. So the objection that then comes is the guy who went old and did fall into evil, why did Allah not take him when he was younger then? So the logical sort of fallacy of it became clear, and Imam Ash'ari then who became one of the greatest opponents of I'tizal. He became one of the greatest people to oppose I'tizal and became one of the Imams of the Ahlul Sunnah. But it was on this point that nothing is wajib on Allah. Nothing is obligatory upon Allah. Allah doesn't have to do anything. You can't say that Allah had to do this. For example, when we say that Allah Ta'ala has taken responsibility for our rizq, and we know that from the Quran. What does Allah Ta'ala say in the Quran? وَمَا مِن دَابَّةٍ فِي الْأَرْضِ إِلَّا عَلَى اللَّهِ رِزْقُهَا. That there's nothing which travels upon the earth except that Allah has taken responsibility for their sustenance. So now can you say that it's wajib upon Allah, it's necessary, it's obligatory upon Allah to provide for us? The answer is no. We do not affirm anything being obligatory upon Allah. You can't force anything upon Allah because Allah is supreme. Allah is absolutely sovereign. There's nothing which can be forced upon Allah. So in this point, what we say here is that when Allah Ta'ala gives guidance, when He gives protection, when He gives afiyah, all of these are by His fadl. These are all by His grace. Everything is by His favor and His mercy. And when He says, وَيُضِلُّ مَن يَشَاءُ, Allah Ta'ala misguides whoever He wills, وَيَخْذُلُ وَيَبْتَلِي, and then He, like, khizlan basically means not having the ability to do good. Allah Ta'ala removes the ability to do goodness and removes the ability to guidance from such people. وَيَبْتَلِي, and then He puts them into tribulations. Is this a punishment from Allah? No, it says adla. This is His adl, this is His justice. Never ever ever ask Allah for His justice. Never ask Allah for justice. Because if Allah applied His justice, we wouldn't even be able to account for the hand that we have, the eye that we have, the sense of hearing that we have. We wouldn't even be able to account for 1 week's worth of food that we have. We can't, like as Imam Shaykh Sadi Rahmatullah alayhi mentions, he says that every time you breathe once, 2 shukr become wajib upon you. Why? Because when you breathe in, this extends your life. That's 1 bounty that Allah gave you. And then when you breathe out, that gives peace to you again, because then obviously if you hold your breath for long enough, what happens? You start turning red and then blue and then black and then you pass out. So breathing out is a bounty of Allah, breathing in is a bounty of Allah. For every single breath, 1 breath, you have to give shukr twice. That's notwithstanding everything else that's going on at the same time. So it's never possible to fulfill the right of Allah. So never ever fall into the mistake of asking Allah for His justice and His adl. Always, always ask Allah for His mercy and His fadl. Ya Allah, we seek of You of Your bounty and Your grace, not of Your justice. Because Your justice, if you're just anyone to whom the justice of Allah is applied, that person has failed in akhirah. Because we can never live up to the justice of Allah. That famous event, isn't there, of somebody who was worshipping for hundreds of years, and then on the Day of Judgment Allah Ta'ala forgives him. Allah Ta'ala forgives him and says, go to paradise of my mercy. The way the narration goes, he says, Ya Allah, of my mercy, of Your mercy, I worshipped all of these years, and why not of Your justice? And then Allah calls him back and the scales are put out, and 1 eye of his is put onto the scale, or 1 body part of his is put onto the scale, and all of his years and centuries of ibadah are written off by just 1 bounty of Allah. Never ask for His adl, always ask for His fadl. Always seek His pleasure, always seek His bounty, because that's all we're needy of. We seek His bounty and His mercy and His pardon, nothing more, nothing less. And then he says, كُلُّهُمْ يَتَقَلَّبُونَ فِي مَشِيئَتِهِ بَيْنَ فَضْلِهِ وَعَدْلِهِ. Everything is like changing between in His mashi'ah, between fadl and adl, between His grace and His justice, His grace and His justice. So on this point, for example, we are Muslims, alhamdulillah. Is that because of His adl? Is that because of His justice? No. This is pure and pure His fadl. And those who are non-Muslims, is that because of an injustice? No, that's because of His adl. That's His justice. And that's the idea of punishment in the akhirah as well, that when people are rewarded in the akhirah, this is His fadl, this is His grace, this is His bounty. Where anyone who's punished in the akhirah, this is His adl and His justice. There's no injustice with Allah. Everything is just, everything is fair, everything is balanced with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. The next line we did earlier, وَلَا غَالِبَ لِأَمْرِهِ. There's none who can dominate the command of Allah. There's none who can overcome the command of Allah. This is an important point for the believers, and you'll see those of you that Allah Ta'ala grant us all tawfiq, those of you that read the Quran regularly, if you read Surah Yusuf, you'll see that this, like a verse with this ma'na is repeated. وَاللَّهُ غَالِبٌ عَلَىٰ أَمْرِهِ. وَاللَّهُ غَالِبٌ عَلَىٰ أَمْرِهِ. Allah was dominant over His affair. If you look at the story of Yusuf alayhi salam, what do you see? He's born, gets thrown into a well by his brothers, he gets rescued. At first glance appears to be a rescue, he gets taken into slavery, gets sold in a market in Egypt, gets blamed for something that he didn't do, ends up in prison. Every time there's a problem for him, the verse comes, Wallahu ghalibun ala amri. Allah was dominant over his affair. Allah had control of the affair. Allah was in control. And as a believer, this is important for us. That when life throws you into turmoil, and your job might be a bit sketchy, you might lose your job, you might have trouble at home, you might be struggling to pay the bills, you might have this problem, that problem, you might have health problems, family problems, always remind yourself, Wallahu ghalibun ala amri. Allah is dominant over our affairs. We have Allah. We don't need anything else. Might feel difficult at the time, but we have Allah, and when you have Allah, Allah will make sure that you're not drowned by your problems. You're not overcome by your problems. Because, as he says here, La ghaliba li amri. There's nothing that can dominate and overcome and prevail over the command of Allah. Allah's command will be supreme. And that's in all affairs. That's in all matters, no matter how difficult life becomes, whether that's at the global stages like we're seeing in Palestine and Lebanon, and it seems like there's no end to it. It seems like people are feeling like we're defeated. No. Wallahu ghalibun ala amri. Every single person that's martyred sees their palace in paradise before their blood touches the ground. And everyone that survives, Allah Ta'ala raises their ranks to ranks that we can't even imagine that those people are being given. And this is this temporary world, 50, 60, 70, 80 years, and then what? Then we come into the real life and we realize, Wallahu ghalibun ala amri. Allah was dominant over the affair the entire time. And all of this becomes a hujjah for those tyrants and those terrorists that are afflicting this upon those people. Yet we still do dua, Allah Ta'ala grant afiyah and grant them ease and grant them victory and grant them freedom from this tyranny. But that doesn't change the fact that this is all a test. But we never despair from world affairs and life affairs for this reason. Wallahu ghalibun ala amri. Allah is dominant over all things. Nothing can overcome and prevail over and dominate over the will of Allah and the command of Allah. Yeah.
Why does Allah choose to misguide some people?
This is His justice. Remember, when we say Allah chooses to misguide, in reality what we're affirming is that when those people exercise their free will, they would have fallen into misguidance. Allah creates that for them. Otherwise, it's just their own free will that's being exercised. Because if we say that Allah forces misguidance upon them, and then those people stand on the Day of Judgment and say, Ya Allah, all those believers are going to paradise, you let them go to paradise, or you forced me into disbelief. They weren't forced into disbelief, they chose disbelief. Like we haven't been forced into belief, we're choosing to believe, and that's of His mercy that He's facilitated that for us. And then He finishes this part of the text where He says, Amanna bidhalika kulli. We believe in all of this that we studied. All of these points that we talked about in the last 7 or so lessons, we believe in all of those points. وَأَيْقَنَّا أَنَّ كُلًّا مِنْ عِنْدِهِ. And we affirm with certainty, that all of that has come from Allah. So up to this point, we reach a checkpoint in the work. Up to this point, he finishes a broad discussion or an overall discussion about the attributes of Allah Ta'ala. In the next lesson, he starts talking about the Prophet Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam, some of his descriptions, not necessarily from a Shama'il perspective, but more from an Aqidah perspective. Like from a theology perspective, what's the role of the Prophet Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam? And this is a problem because you have some people, Allah Ta'ala guide them, that they say that they're Muslims, and we don't doubt their Islam, but nonetheless, some of the questionable things that they say things like, oh, the Prophet ﷺ, he was just a postman, he came, delivered the message and he's gone. From a theological perspective, is that what we affirm for the Prophet ﷺ? Well, no, of course not. Of course not. Right? From a theological perspective, you have no iman if you don't have the Prophet ﷺ. And the ulama often mention this, remember this as a point. La ilaha illallah doesn't make you Muslim. La ilaha illallah doesn't make you Muslim. La ilaha illallah is the first step of Islam, but that Islam is only acceptable when you affirm Muhammadur Rasulullah as well. Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam. Without Muhammadur Rasulullah, La ilaha illallah is not going to benefit you. La ilaha illallah is only acceptable in the presence of Allah when that La ilaha illallah is in the colors of Muhammadur Rasulullah. That's important. That we don't, what we believe about the Prophet ﷺ from a theology perspective Right? The Prophet ﷺ has a key and essential role in our beliefs. And inshallah, we'll come on to that in the next lesson. And then after that, there's some other discussions about the hawd, and then we come back to a discussion of destiny as well, the vision of Allah Ta'ala, ru'ya, and other things as well. Are there any questions? Yeah.
Imam Al-Tahawi at the start, he was a Shafi, and then he became Hanafi. Did he adopt the Maturidi creed, or did he adopt the Ash'ari creed? I know they came afterwards.
Yeah, I mean, you wouldn't affirm that he adopted either one of those creeds in that sense, but you could say that the text that he's written seems to be pushing and adopting the Maturidi point. For evidence on that, there's actually a section that comes later. There's a text that we've gone through, but I didn't touch on it. This La Ghaliba li Amri, which alludes to the idea of Taqween. Taqween, I'm saying this because you probably understand this, right? But the idea of Taqween is a very Maturidi thing, as opposed to an Ash'ari thing. The Ash'aris, they're not too fond of Taqween. What is?
You keep saying Ash'ari and Maturidi.
Yeah.
What are they?
Okay. Yeah. So what's Ash'ari and what's Maturidi? So they take their name from two Imams. Imam Abu Mansur Maturidi and Imam Ash'ari. They were around at the same time. Funnily enough, they were contemporaries. They were around at the same time. But in geography, they were in different places. Imam Ash'ari was in Iraq, and Imam Maturidi was in like modern day Uzbekistan. So they call it Mawara or Nahr in the books, modern day Uzbekistan. So what it was is when the sort of early misguided beliefs started coming about, there was two key Imams of that time who set out the Aqidah of the Ahlul Sunnah. One was Imam Maturidi and one was Imam Ash'ari. And then the followers of each of them came to be known as the Ash'aris and the Maturidis. Between them, they have some very subtle differences, but those subtle differences are quite minor. They're not major differences, such that we would consider that they're different from the Ahlul Sunnah. Both of them are mainstream belief systems within the Ahlul Sunnah. Usually, they often say that the Hanafis tend to be Maturidi, and the other Madhahib tend to be Ash'ari, but it's not like in stone. You can have Ash'ari Maturidis. I mean, just out of interest, they often say that the purest of the pure Hanafis and Sunnis are the Hanafi Maturidi Naqshbandis. Not that I'm biased in any way. We'll know. Yeah, but that answers the question. Are there any questions on this side? Okay, I'll take on this. Yeah, go.
You said 2 lessons ago, a person who affirms anything that creation has to Allah, and that's a figment in their mind, and they're praying to a figment in their mind. When you say that person is a kafir, then
You wouldn't affirm kufr for such people if that's the route that you take with them, because kufr is a very high bar. Kufr is an extremely high bar, very, very high. And the ulama always shied away from kufr. They would say things like he's misguided, which we would affirm. They say that he's not right, which again we would affirm. But expressly saying that such people are kafir, it's problematic. So we would shy away from saying that. Especially for people like us, like we're just students, and it's not for us to like pass out these fatwa. Because think about what we're saying. When you say somebody is a kafir, and this is general advice for all of us, especially those of you that are on like social media. Social media seems to be a cesspool for this stuff. Like everyone is a kafir on social media to everyone, right? Except me and my 5 people on my street. Everybody else is a kafir. Right? It's crazy. Kufr is such a high bar that what are you doing? You're declaring that that person is now doomed to hell for the rest of eternity. And it's a dangerous allegation to make, because when you say that somebody is a kafir, it's a curse, it's a la'na, right? The greatest la'na that can be given. And the nature of la'na is that if it's not befitting of the person to whom it's addressed, it comes back to the person that sent it. It's very scary. Never ever fall into that idea. Look, there's no sawab in calling someone a kafir. And people like us, people like me, people like you, that we're just normal students, nobody is going to be following what I and you say. So there's no reason for us to stick out our necks and say, oh yeah, remember that guy over there who posted that video 6 months ago? He's a kafir. Yeah, why are you doing that? There's no reason for you to do that. Why are you putting that responsibility on your shoulders? It's a very, very dangerous thing to do. Leave that to the ulama. And when you see the ulama, the true scholars, you'll find that the word kafir is very, very difficult on their tongue. They don't say the word kafir very easily because they understand what it means. So always be careful of that field. But to answer your question, it definitely be misguidance. We wouldn't affirm kufr for them expressly. We would affirm misguidance and the like. But we would try to guide those people and explain to them that this is why we don't affirm it as we do, because that's giving similitude to the creation of Allah. In that situation, if a person was a kafir before, like for example, let's imagine somebody is like what expressly we know to be a kafir. What's a kafir? A person who denies one of the core beliefs of Islam. Let me give you an example. And this is something I don't shy away from. Let me give you an example. The finality of the Prophet ﷺ's messengership. The Prophet is the final messenger of Allah. This is not a secondary belief of Islam. This is a core belief of Islam. This is a core belief of Islam. So in this core belief of Islam, anyone who denies that the Prophet is the final Prophet of Allah, as Muslims we have confirmed that that person is a kafir. Why? Because they've expressly denied a belief of Islam. What the ulama would do, the way the scholars do it, is this. They wouldn't say that this person here is a kafir. X person over there is a kafir. They don't usually say in words the name of the person that they're referring to. Rather, what they would often say is anyone who ascribes to such beliefs, this belief is kufr and those people are kafir. So somebody who believes that there can be a prophet after our Prophet ﷺ, anyone who follows that belief is a kafir. That's the way they would present it. So in that sense, you wouldn't really like say X individual is a kafir. That's the scholarly way of doing it. In regards to your question, if somebody was a kafir earlier and then becomes Muslim, you can't affirm that they were in a state of kufr and then Allah guided them to Islam. But on a secondary note, away from the theology, it's often best not to remind people of dark pasts. Whether that's kufr into Islam or whether that's a life of sin into practice, it's often best to give people hope rather than remind them of bad times. Allah Ta'ala brought you into practice, but you were doing this. That often disheartens a person, it undermines a person. The Prophet ﷺ said, Bashiru wa la tunafiru. Give glad tidings, don't make people tunafir. Don't put them off. So reminding people of their past is often a bit of a dangerous thing to do. So we don't do that. We try to give hope to people, inshallah. Any other questions? Your question first.
If everything is written down for us, then should we be concerned about what's going to happen in the future?
Yeah, because again it comes back to our understanding of decree and destiny, doesn't it? When you say everything is written down for us, just because it's been reported as Allah's infinite knowledge of what's going to happen, we always affirm that we aren't doing what's happening, or we're not doing what we're doing because it was written. Rather, Allah wrote it because of our free will. He knew what we were going to do. Remember, it's the example I gave you of the I am rude, and the writing. It's exactly that. So we do the best we can, and then we leave it to Allah.
Going back to the Tajseem chapter. So if someone says Allah has a hand, but we don't know
Scary words like Tajseem.
if someone says Allah has a hand, but we don't know the howness, the kayfiyah, and you said this is Aqidah point of Ahlul Sunnah, or we said
Yeah, it goes back to the idea. I mean, simply, what does Tajseem mean? The funny thing is, the English word is scary than the Arabic word. What's the English word? Where are you? That's the one. Anthropomorphism. How can I pronounce it? Right? People who affirm a body for Allah. That's what Tajseem is. The Mujassima. People who affirm a physical body for Allah. That, when you have words like Yad, Wajh, Saq and things in the Quran, then all we do is there's two ways of dealing with it. Either ta'weel or tafweed. We talked about this a couple of lessons ago, remember? Ta'weel is to interpret it in a way, and tafweed is just to assign the ma'na to Allah. If you do any one of these two things, then that's within the Ahlul Sunnah. If you fall into Tajseem, which was basically affirming a body for Allah, that's outside the Ahlul Sunnah. And likewise, if you fall into a concept called ta'til, which is negating the attribute altogether, you say, no, there's no such thing as wajh, even though the Quran says wajhullah. There's no such thing as yad, even though the Quran says yadullah. This is ta'til. We don't do that either. That's the other extreme. We either interpret it as the ulama have interpreted it, or we assign the ma'na to Allah and that's it. This is the Ahlul Sunnah way. Affirming a body, this is not Ahlul Sunnah, and negating it altogether, this is not Ahlul Sunnah either. Yeah.
Do you know how we heard somebody killed 100 people and then Allah forgave him at the end, and then we vice versa, you might have somebody who like touched people all their life and then that Aqidah isn't very good. Is that, I'm not sure what my question is that due to, what is it due to then?
That's the justice of Allah. So that first part is from a hadith. The guy who kills people and then he's on the way to the 100th person and then he dies on the way. That's the beauty of his intention. So that's about the fadail of intention. But ultimately that's the justice of Allah. That's the justice and the mercy of Allah. But on the other hand, the person who might at first glance have lived a long life of piety and then at the end fell down and failed, again that's the justice of Allah. Because remember, all of these things aren't forced upon us. All of these things came about because of our free will and our choice. That's why it's happened. So we can't blame Allah for the free will and the choice that we exercised. So that's why it wouldn't be problematic for the justice of Allah. This is all His justice.
And when we talk about His love, Allah taking the ability to raise good, what does that exactly mean, and how can a person be accountable to the
So the end part?
Is it not taking the ability to do good? How can a person be accountable if he's had the ability taken away from him? What does that exactly mean?
Yeah. So what does Islam mean? So the way we explained it earlier was Allah taking away the ability to do. It doesn't mean that Allah takes away the ability, so therefore is forcing them into evil. Rather what it means is, because remember what we said, that when a person exercises their free will and then they choose to do something good, Allah facilitates that goodness for them. This is the opposite. So when they're choosing to do evil, by definition they're then choosing not to do goodness. And that path to goodness is removed from them because by Allah's will, and that's how they fall into evil. Khidlan is the opposite of tawfiq. In the Arabic word, so those of you that follow the Arabic, tawfiq is the ability to do good, and khidlan is the inability to do good. So that's how the two concepts will run together. Any other questions? Yeah.
You know, we get always asked this question, when there's earthquakes, there's floods, and all these things that happen, we being a creator, the question is why would such a creator allow these things to happen? This is not what free will and everything is that's the reason why that there's 1,000 people die in an earthquake, they die in a flood, Allah has done this, so what is the
Yeah, I mean, it's usually it's part of the framing of the way atheists frame this idea of the problem of evil. And that's not a problem for us, in simple terms, because what we affirm is Allah is the possessor of all things. And everything belongs to Allah. Allah exercising His will within the creation, and Allah Ta'ala testing the creation in whichever way He wills, this is not an injustice. So these things like earthquakes, for example, these things like floods and natural disasters and death or whatever it might be, all of this is Allah's will to test the people. Because this dunya, in our understanding, remember as Muslims we conceptualize the dunya as well. The dunya is not the be-all end-all. As the Prophet described it, he said, the dunya mazra'atul akhirah. He says the dunya is like the field for the akhirah. In other words, you plant your seeds here, and then you benefit from that in the akhirah. So in this world, when natural disasters and things like that strike, Allah Ta'ala has given us guidance about how to deal with that. So being in a state of goodness and ease, this is a test. But likewise, being in a state of difficulty and problems, this is also a test. So all of these things that happen, these would be tests from Allah. And Allah is testing how a person would react to that. Now, the second question that then comes is, does Allah's testing a person negate His love or His mercy for that person? The answer is no. Because that would only be the case if by passing the test and then nothing happened. But when you pass the test and you show patience and you show faith, Allah rewards you in this dunya and in the akhirah as well.
Would we consider the early generations of the Hanabila and the Athari to be part of the Ahlul Sunnah?
Sorry, what's the question?
So would we consider the early stages of the Hanabila and they came to be like Athari?
You would.
Ahlul Sunnah.
What's the difference between the Athari Muqawwid and the Athari, the Surah Athari?
Well, that's a question. These are two complex Arabic words for me.
The early Atharis and the nowadays.
long questions. Simple questions. Simple questions. I'm a simple person, I don't answer complex questions. Simply put, the Atharis are effectively people who fell into literalism. See, this is a simple answer, it's not the detail of it. Later Atharis fell into literalism and then affirmed bodies for Allah. So the answers in your question, the Atharis of the early Atharis, they did tafweed. In their attempts to do ta'weel, the later Atharis ended up in tajseem and then fell out of the Ahl Sunnah. This is the simplest way of understanding it. There's much more detail to it, there's much more complexity to it. This is the simple answer, so that's the best I can give. Any other questions? Okay, so we'll stop there. So Jazakallah for everybody's attendance. And inshallah, as I said last lesson, if there are any questions or any problems, we feel free to share them on the group, inshallah.